I'm just fine.
Excuse me, I'm still coming unglued here. I'm not used to that.
Well, you were joking with Mr. Fraser about the garden.
On an early 1980 night in Burbank, the studio lights hit Truman Capote like an interrogation lamp. Millions of Americans watched a literary legend sink into the Tonight Show chair. Small body, oversized reputation, eyes glossy with something he couldn't hide. Johnny Carson asked a simple question. Capote tried to answer, but the sentence collapsed before it reached daylight. The audience laughed, then stopped, unsure if they were witnessing comedy or a public unraveling. Carson kept smiling because the show must keep moving, even when a guest can't. And when the cameras cut to commercial, something invisible snapped into place. Not a scandal, a silence. How much power did a late-night host really have? And what happened to stars who crossed that unwritten line? A talk show, Blacklist, in America rarely looks like a courtroom sentence. It looks like an empty chair that never gets offered again. No paperwork, no press release, no on-air announcement that says you are banned. Instead, it's a quiet chain reaction inside a small ecosystem built on access. Late night is not just entertainment. It's a distribution network for fame. In the 1970s and 1980s, before Twitter storms and viral apology videos, a single Tonight Show booking could rescue a film's opening weekend, turn a book into a bestseller, or revive a career that had gone cold. And the gate to that rescue was controlled by a handful of people. The host, the executive producer, the talent bookers, the network, and the publicists who negotiated the invisible terms. The host wasn't only a comedian. He was a brand, and brands operate like monarchies. Loyalty is rewarded, unpredictability is punished, and humiliation must never touch the throne. That's why the most feared form of discipline wasn't a public feud. It was no callback. Because in this system, absence is a signal. If Johnny Carson didn't invite you back, everyone else understood what that meant. Agents stopped pitching you as safe. Publicists stopped offering you as reliable. Networks stopped gambling on you as worth the risk. The blacklist wasn't a list pinned to a wall. It was a shared instinct, a professional whisper passed between offices. Don't book them. Don't put your show in danger. And danger wasn't just scandal. Danger could mean dead airtime, a host losing control, a studio feeling unsafe, or a segment becoming the clip people replay for the wrong reason. Late night runs on timing, seconds matter, rhythms matter. And the host's greatest power is not the jokes. It's the ability to keep the machine moving while making it look effortless. When a guest threatens that illusion, the response is ruthless because the stakes are commercial. Advertisers, affiliates, ratings, and the network's promise that tonight will be smooth. This is why the talk show Blacklist feels colder than tabloid chaos. Scandals burn hot and then fade. But a closed door, never explained, can erase you in slow motion, while you're still standing there, smiling, wondering what rule you broke. In late-night television, the most dangerous thing a guest can do is force the host to reveal the truth behind the format. That control is not automatic, it is enforced. The audience comes for spontaneity, but the business survives on predictability. That is why television sins fall into patterns. Different faces, same underlying threat. One pattern is the violation of physical safety on a stage designed to feel harmless. Another is the disrespect of airtime itself, arriving in a condition that turns an interview into dead weight. And the deepest sin, the one that echoes like betrayal, is breaking the unwritten loyalty contract that late night runs on. You do not challenge the king from across the street. Each of these sins has its own signature moment, a frozen frame that producers remember more clearly than the guest's entire career, because that frame is what advertisers, affiliates, and network executives fear. In 1987, on Late Night with David Letterman, the frame was a raised leg, a sudden kick, and a host's body moving backward on instinct. Crispin Glover was not a typical guest even by Letterman's standards, and that's saying something. Letterman could handle weird. He could handle awkward. He could even build comedy out of discomfort. The show's identity, especially in contrast to the polished authority of Carson, was that it welcomed the offbeat. But there is a line between weird, that can be packaged, and unpredictable, that can injure someone. The moment Glover launched a high kick toward the desk, whether meant as a stunt, a joke, or a performative burst of chaos, the optics changed instantly. This was no longer an actor promoting a film. This was a body moving in a way that forced the host to protect himself on camera. It didn't matter if the foot missed. It didn't matter if Glover later claimed it was part of a character. The message to the studio, to the producers, to the network, and to every person whose job was to reduce risk was simple. The host can't guarantee safety when this person is in the room. Late night is built around a desk for a reason. The desk is a boundary, visual, psychological, symbolic. The guest sits on one side, the host on the other, and the audience subconsciously reads the rules. This is a controlled conversation. The moment a guest turns it into a physical threat, the show is no longer an interview, it becomes an incident report. And when the host stands up, when the host flinches, when the host breaks posture, the power dynamic is exposed. The audience doesn't just laugh. They learn that the host can be cornered, and that is poisonous to the brand. Letterman's power wasn't the absolute monarchy Carson represented, but he still operated a machine that could not afford to look vulnerable. A guest who makes the host dodge is not quirky. He is a liability. The aftermath doesn't require a dramatic confrontation. That's not how television discipline works. Discipline is logistical. It is calendar-based. It is silence disguised as scheduling. You don't invite them back. You stop returning calls. You tell the publicist, "Not right now." Then "not right now" becomes "not this year." Then it becomes "not at all." The blacklist in this form is not moral judgment. It's operational self-defense. The show's first job is to deliver a predictable product. A guest who might create an unsafe moment threatens the product. So the system quietly removes the variable. But physical danger is only one kind of violation. A more common sin is the one that looks almost tragic rather than threatening. Showing up unable to perform the basic contract of television, which is coherence. Truman Capote's Tonight Show moment in 1980 did not involve kicking or lunging. It involved something more uncomfortable. The slow collapse of language. Capote, the master of sentences, the architect of public persona, sat under the lights and couldn't complete the simplest task. Answer a question. Here the power dynamic becomes subtler, because Carson's face matters more than Capote's. Carson is not just interviewing a man. He is protecting the show from the void. Dead air is the late-night equivalent of blood in the water. It signals to advertisers and affiliates that the host cannot steer the ship. And yet Carson also had to protect something else. The illusion that the show is friendly, that it is not cruel, that it doesn't exploit a guest's weakness. In that moment, Carson's smile becomes a tool, part empathy, part damage control, part silent verdict. He simplifies. He adjusts. He gives Capote smaller steps, smaller ramps, fewer opportunities to fall. This is not kindness alone. It is the host's instinct to keep the machine moving. The audience laughs nervously because laughter is what television trains them to do when they don't know what else to do. They laugh to cover shame. They laugh to avoid admitting they're watching a human being fail. And then the commercial break arrives like a curtain drop. On the surface, nothing has been announced. No one says, "You are not welcome here." But in the backstage logic, that segment becomes a warning label. The question isn't, was Capote brilliant? Everyone already knows that. The question becomes, is Capote reliable? Reliability is currency in late night. A guest who cannot deliver coherent airtime is not just embarrassing. He is expensive. He wastes a slot that could have been sold to a studio film, a network project, a book release. He forces the host to work harder. He risks a segment that is replayed not for promotion but for collapse. And in the pre-social media era, The Tonight Show wasn't just one platform among many. It was the platform. If you lost it, you didn't simply lose exposure, you lost legitimacy. There is a crucial distinction here that explains why some comedians could appear intoxicated and still be welcomed, while others became cautionary tales. High but functional can still create usable television, because it produces jokes, stories, rhythm, and punchlines. Incapacitated produces nothing but risk. Late night can weaponize dysfunction only when it can be shaped into entertainment. When it becomes unshapeable, the show protects itself. Carson, with his old-school authority, could tolerate chaos when it made him look like the calm center. But if the chaos made the show look unstable, the tolerance evaporated. The blacklist, in Capote's case, is not necessarily a moral condemnation of addiction or weakness. It is a business decision disguised as etiquette. The show does not want to be responsible for the next collapse. It does not want to gamble that the guest will be better next time. In a system where the host's power is partly myth, the host cannot allow a guest to turn the stage into a place where myth dissolves. Then there is the third sin, the most politically lethal one, betrayal of the unwritten loyalty contract. This is where Joan Rivers becomes the perfect case study, because her crime wasn't a moment of chaos on camera. It was a decision made off camera that detonated her relationship with the most powerful desk in America. Rivers wasn't just a guest. She was, for a time, part of the Tonight Show machinery, trusted enough to fill in, trusted enough to sit in the host's seat when Carson was away. That is a rare privilege in a system built on hierarchy. When a host allows you to substitute for him, he is lending you his legitimacy. He is letting you borrow the crown, even briefly, in front of millions of viewers. The audience starts to associate you with the throne. And once that happens, the relationship becomes deeper than booking. It becomes symbolic. Rivers' ambition, taking a deal to host her own show on a new network, Fox, positioned directly against Carson, was not simply career movement. It was a declaration that she would build a competing kingdom using the very credibility the Tonight Show had granted her. In a normal industry, that might be called upward mobility. In late night's feudal logic, it can be seen as treason. The detail that transforms this story from ordinary competition to blacklist territory is the question of notice, of respect, of whether Carson was informed before the news became public. Because power in television is not only about contracts. It is about face. When you humiliate a powerful figure by making him learn something important from someone else, you don't just compete with him, you strip him of control over his own narrative. Late-night hosts are storytellers, but they are also guardians of image. Carson's image was not only that he was funny, it was that he was the center of the universe. The Tonight Show desk was a gravitational field. When Rivers stepped out of that field to create a competing orbit, the offense was not only professional. It was personal in the way power always becomes personal. And the punishment, in the logic of the era, would not need to be shouted. Carson did not need to go on television and denounce her. That would create drama, and drama could make Rivers look important. The cleaner move is to remove oxygen, to stop speaking her name, to stop booking her, to let the industry understand. This is where the talk show blacklist shows its most chilling feature. It often functions through reputation management rather than explicit bans. Networks, bookers, producers, agents, all of them watch the host's temperature. If the host is cold toward you, the system becomes cold too. People in Hollywood don't always need orders. They need signals. And Carson's silence was one of the strongest signals available. In that era, Carson's show was not just a popular program. It was an institution. Being absent from it repeatedly was not neutral. It suggested you were unsafe, undesirable, or disloyal. That suggestion could ripple outward into other bookings, other opportunities, other negotiations. Rivers didn't just lose a chair. She risked losing her status as a rightful citizen of late night. What makes this case especially powerful for a documentary is its moral complexity. Rivers was a woman climbing in a male-dominated world, and the rules she was expected to follow were not written down in any employee handbook. She was supposed to be grateful, loyal, patient, waiting for a throne that might never be offered. Because the truth about succession in late night is brutal. There are heirs, and then there are placeholders. A host might elevate you as a frequent guest or substitute, but that does not mean he intends to hand you the crown. It can mean he intends to use you as proof of generosity, as evidence that the kingdom is benevolent, while keeping the throne firmly in place. When Rivers took a deal that gave her her own platform, she was refusing to be a placeholder. That refusal is the heartbeat of her story. And yet the industry punishes refusal, because refusal breaks the spell that keeps everyone behaving. If one person can walk out and build something across the street, then the king's desk looks less permanent. The system cannot allow that lesson to spread. So it enforces the unwritten rule. You may leave, but you will pay in silence. If Crispin Glover represents the moment a host's physical safety is threatened, and Capote represents the moment airtime itself becomes unusable, Rivers represents something deeper, the threat to the hierarchy. And hierarchy is the true religion of late night. The host's desk is the altar. Guests come to be blessed with exposure. Publicists come to negotiate access. Studios come to sell stories. When a guest violates safety, the response is to protect bodies. When a guest disrespects airtime, the response is to protect the product. When a guest breaks loyalty, the response is to protect the monarchy. Different sins, same result. The door quietly closes. The audience rarely sees the decision being made. They only see the absence later, months later, years later, when a name that once appeared constantly is suddenly missing. That absence is what creates the mythology of banned guests. But in reality, the system doesn't need myths. It needs compliance. And compliance is easier to maintain when punishment is ambiguous. If you can't point to a written ban, you can't fight it. If you can't name the rule you broke, you can't appeal the verdict. You just fade. The most unsettling part is how ordinary it can look from the outside. Crispin Glover can still act. Truman Capote can still be celebrated as a writer. Joan Rivers can still perform for audiences. Life continues. But the late-night chair, the chair that validates you as part of mainstream America, stays out of reach. And because late night is recorded history, because clips replay, because networks archive, the absence becomes permanent. Not invited is not the same as forgotten, but it is a step toward erasure. The talk show Blacklist is not a guillotine. It is a slow shut of doors, a tightening of corridors, a narrowing of light. And the people who carry it out rarely have to call themselves villains. They can call themselves professionals. They can call themselves protectors of the show. They can call it business. Meanwhile, the person on the outside is left with a question that haunts more than any headline. Was it one moment, one mistake, one decision, or was the system always waiting for a reason? To understand why these bans carried so much weight, you have to understand that late-night hosts didn't just run shows, they ran climates. Johnny Carson's climate was authority disguised as ease. He sat behind that desk like the country's most relaxed judge, and that posture made his power feel natural. Carson didn't need to argue with you. He didn't need to publicly punish you. If he decided you were no longer useful, no longer safe, or no longer loyal, he could simply stop calling, and the industry would interpret that silence as a verdict. In the era of 3 major networks and a handful of national gatekeepers, that verdict mattered because there weren't 10 other platforms of equal prestige waiting to replace it. A Carson booking was still a cultural stamp. It said, America is comfortable with this person. Lose that stamp, and you didn't just lose airtime, you lost an invisible category called acceptability. David Letterman, by contrast, built a different climate. His show's identity, especially in the 1980s, was that it could host awkwardness and turn it into comedy. He welcomed guests who were strange, confrontational, or socially off balance, because that tension created the kind of unpredictable moments his audience loved. Letterman could invite weird, because the brand of late night was partially a rebellion against the polished TV monarchy that Carson represented. But that rebellion had boundaries. Letterman's tolerance was aesthetic, not anarchic. He would let a guest be bizarre, but he would not let a guest seize control of the room physically. That's why something like Crispin Glover's high kick wasn't just eccentricity. It was a direct violation of the format's safety contract. Even the anti-establishment host cannot allow the stage to become unsafe, because the moment the host is forced to dodge, the entire illusion collapses. In other words, Letterman could risk awkwardness. He could not risk violence, even implied. That's the hidden rule that separates legendary weird segment from never book them again. And then there is the modern era, where the power of late night is still real but diluted. Today, a celebrity can recover from a late-night disaster by going direct to audience on social media, by releasing their own statement, by doing a podcast, by dropping behind-the-scenes content, by reframing the narrative without needing a host's blessing. Cancel culture moves faster, but gatekeeping is more fragmented. The audience can punish you instantly, but it can also forgive you instantly. Meanwhile, the talk show host no longer holds the same monopoly on legitimacy. That changes what a blacklist means. In Carson's time, being frozen out could starve you of mainstream oxygen. In the modern era, being frozen out is often one problem among many, painful but not always fatal. So when you ask, would any of this even be possible in the age of social media? The answer is complicated. The bans might not be as absolute, but the punishments can be more public. Carson could erase you through silence because his era allowed silence to function like a wall. Today, silence is harder to maintain. Screenshots spread, clips go viral, fan communities organize, and even a host's decision not to book someone can become a story. In some ways, that transparency reduces the cold power of the unwritten rule. But in another way, it creates a new danger. Now the punishment can be permanent for a different reason because the clip never dies and the algorithm never forgets. The core difference across eras is not whether people make mistakes on TV. They always have. The difference is who gets to define the mistake. In Carson's monarchy, the host defined it. In Letterman's format, the show defined it. In the modern age, the internet defines it. Sometimes accurately, sometimes brutally, sometimes without context. But the original question remains. Who controls culture when a single moment is replayed until it becomes a life sentence? The public loves the drama of a ban, but the people living inside it experience something quieter and more corrosive. Professional exile without a clear end date. In the short term, it can look almost invisible. There's no headline that says, "This person is no longer allowed on television." There's just a pattern that begins to form. A new movie comes out, a book releases, a tour launches, and the familiar late-night couch remains empty. Invitations don't arrive. Calls don't get returned. Publicists stop fighting for the booking because they know how the room feels. Agents stop pitching because they don't want to burn favors on a no. And slowly, the person becomes harder to place in the public imagination, not because they stopped being talented, but because the machine stopped amplifying them. For someone like Crispin Glover, the consequence was being framed as an incident rather than an artist. A single on-air moment can become a shorthand label, unpredictable, unsafe, too risky, especially in an industry that values clean narratives. Whether or not he intended harm becomes less important than the fact that the clip exists. The clip is evidence, and evidence is what gatekeepers use to justify exclusion without ever admitting it is exclusion. A producer doesn't need to say, "I don't like him." They can say, "Remember what happened last time." That is the cold efficiency of television memory. For Truman Capote, the consequence is even more tragic because it intersects with vulnerability. When a public figure appears incapacitated, the audience's reaction can harden into a single image: collapse. And collapse is contagious in the way networks fear. It raises questions about reliability, about consent, about exploitation. So the safest move for the institution is to avoid repeating the scenario. That avoidance can look like moral caution. We don't want to put him through that again. But it can also function as abandonment. The door closes under the language of professionalism, and the person is left outside with no formal accusation to answer, no clear path to redemption. And then there's Joan Rivers, whose consequence became the most psychologically brutal. Being treated like she violated loyalty in a world where loyalty was demanded but never guaranteed in return. Her punishment wasn't only fewer bookings. It was the sense that a whole era of her identity, her place in late night's inner circle, had been revoked. And what makes her story so powerful is that time eventually proved something. Exile is not always forever, but it can last long enough to reshape a life. Rivers did return to the late-night ecosystem much later, which shows that doors can reopen. Yet the years of silence still function like a scar in the public record. The comeback doesn't erase the exile. It only proves it was real. That is the harsh lesson of talk show blacklists. They don't have to destroy your career in one night. They only have to remove you from the stage where America keeps deciding who still matters. Late-night television sells itself as casual. Just a desk, a laugh, a few stories before America goes to sleep. But behind that casualness is a system built on control, timing, and obedience. Crispin Glover's kick wasn't remembered as performance. It was remembered as risk. Truman Capote's silence wasn't treated as tragedy. It was treated as unusable airtime. Joan Rivers' ambition wasn't judged like business, it was judged like betrayal. Different sins, same punishment. A door that closes without explanation, because the most effective discipline is the kind you can't challenge. In Hollywood, scandals fade. Public feuds burn out. But silence lasts longer than headlines, because silence can't be disproven. You can't defend yourself against an invitation that never arrives. And maybe that's the real question these stories leave behind, not whether the bans were fair, but whether the system was designed to be fair at all. When one desk can decide who gets seen, who gets forgiven, and who gets quietly erased, the culture isn't just being entertained. It's being managed. If you enjoyed this kind of inside power documentary, make sure to subscribe. And tell me in the comments, do you think these bans were justified? Or were they simply the industry protecting its throne?